Okay, how's it going, folks? Let's have a look. Okay, hopefully people can hear me okay. Yep, great. Okay, excellent. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're a little behind, but as always, don't worry about it. We'll get through what we get through, and that's the way it is. Okay, so we're doing fine. Last time we got about to last, I think, slide 8 or so of populations. So we're still in the ecology series. Populations was the second in the ecology series, and we're going to be moving on towards the end of the lecture into species interactions. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is just start off with a bit of a reminder of where we were last time. I've got the iClicker on, so we can just go through. I thought we only got up to slide 6. Okay, well, don't worry, you won't miss anything. Okay, but just a bit of a warm up. We can start with this question, and that is not what I want. Okay, we're doing multiple. What am I doing here? Multiple choice. Go for it. Okay, so the question here is populations can be studied at different spatial scales. We talked about that quite a lot with populations in general, right? And last time we were talking about different spatial scales in ecology. And so the question here is place these spatial scales that I've given in the A through E in a logical order, going from large scale through to small scale. Okay, that should hopefully be fairly straightforward for you. So we're talking about geographical range, populations, metapopulations, and pattern of dispersal. Okay, I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that. Okay, what have we got? 140-ish people so far. Okay. I'm just trying to organize my windows in the meantime so I can see stuff. Okay, 171. What have we got? Any more takers on that? 173. Okay, and I'm going to stop it in 5, 4, 3. When did we mention metapopulation? Yes, last lecture. We covered that just right towards the very end. Now it is up. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. I'll stop on that. So where are we in this? Here's the answer to this: is the geographical range is the largest scale. The metapopulation, if you remember, when you have a population of different individuals that can all interact and breed with one another, they can have connection between different populations in a meta population sort of network where there's a little bit of movement between those different populations potentially. Okay, so E, yeah, people got E there. That's good. And then at the end we talked about pattern of dispersal. So whether when you go down to the individual level where you see those individuals are dispersed within the population. So this is the example that we talked about here, where we talked about the geographical range of this species of plant that lived in Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and then At the next level down, there were metapopulations. I think the species lived on chalkland areas or something, so it can't live everywhere, just where the habitat is suitable. And so there's like this patchwork of different populations, metapopulations that has some connectivity between them. Then you go down to the population level, and then the dispersion refers to this, how are the individuals organized within that space. Talked about regular, random, and clumped. Somebody at the end of the lecture asked me last time of an example of random dispersal, which is apparently quite rare in nature when you get down to the individual level. An example I found was things that are wind dispersed, like dandelions that just happen to be plonked wherever the wind plonks them. Okay. So different examples of that dispersal pattern, okay? So this was the slide that we got up to at the beginning of last time, okay? And we're talking about the variation of populations on a spatial level, okay? That they can be dynamic, and where that population occurs, I do not hear him. I keep logging out and coming back. Can other people hear me? Yes, yes, yes. So I think, okay, your name has disappeared up the screen, but I think it must be at your end it's occurring, I'm afraid. Okay. So dispersal is important within a population. It has important effects on the population spatial dynamics. But also on the numbers in different areas, etc. So this can be broken down into as active dispersal. So where an individual actively moves from one area to the other. So it might be just something like, I'm going to roam around and just find somewhere new to live, perhaps, or something like a seasonal migration, such as you get in wildebeest, for example. Or bird species that migrate north and south at different times of the year. So the population is moving in space depending upon time. Then you can also have passive dispersal. So a good example of this is wind dispersal of things like dandelion seeds and things like that. So they'll be blown off in the wind, and they're not actively flying, they're just being taken by wherever the wind goes. Similar sort of thing can occur with fish eggs, okay, where many fish release their eggs into the water column, and then they drift away, and those eggs end up wherever the ocean currents happen to take them. But this is important because this dispersal provides connectivity between different populations in a metapopulation. So I, for example, talked about, we had that example here where you might have flowers that live in different suitable patches of habitat in different areas, but they could potentially, if they have a wind-borne seed, for example, release something in the wind that moves them to another patch, or their pollen could be taken in the wind and could then fertilize another plant in another patch, for example. So you get this this movement of individuals between populations occurring in different ways. Would an animal that has eaten a seed and then defecates it, seed grows, an example? Yeah, so passive dispersal, I guess that would be a good example of passive dispersal, right? Because that seed is not actively dispersing itself. I guess the animal that's eaten it and passed it through its intestines is being the equivalent of the wind or ocean currents, I guess. So populations can also vary. Ever go through an active dispersal? Can a seed ever go through an active dispersal? I don't know. Not that I can think of, but just because I can't think of it doesn't mean it can't. So variation of populations in time. So some seeds, I think, have pods where that deliberately explode, right? And that disperses them. I don't know if you classify that as active dispersal. Don't know. Population numbers can also change over time. So, so a temporal variation in what population numbers are doing, and that's due to a combination of effects of things like, well, the things being births, so birth of new individuals into the population, deaths, so something dies, so it's removed from the population, and then if you're on a metapopulation network, you could have immigration or emigration potentially from one population into another, right? So immigration meaning something else arrives from a neighboring population into you, and emigration means, you know, one of your population members decides to go somewhere else. And these different patterns of things that can change population numbers can be affected by or modified by things such as the environment. So the environment is important with this. So here's an example for in this study here, where they looked at the predation. So what I mean by an environmental effect is something in the habitat around you that is having effect upon the population inside of it. So here you have predation by another species potentially. In this study, they looked at soybean aphids, and at different times of over 2 months, and then tracked the number of individuals, either in just a natural population, the green line, so it goes up and down a little bit, and then they did a modification, an experimental modification, where they kept any predators on those aphids out, so they couldn't eat them basically. And what you find is you get a bigger change. So these numbers can go up because there's no predators there, so their numbers increase. Then there might be some factors that we'll talk about later that maybe drive their numbers back down again, etc. So you can have these environmental influences that are modifying your population numbers over time. So if you're an ecologist and you want to study a population, obviously one of the key pieces of data that you might need is how many individuals live in this population that I'm studying, and you know, perhaps you're interested in how that changes over time, so you need to track number of individuals in a population over time. Now, one way of doing this, which is a kind of an ideal way basically, is you just go out to your population and you count every individual. So you know, we've kind of just gone through this in a way in the US, right, with a census, where we all fill in our little forms and send it in, and they figure out how many people live in different zip codes, etc. But you can't always do that. You can't always go and count every individual. Say you wanted to know how many ants live in America. Well, it would be impossible to go and, you know, dig up and count and find every single ant in America. So you need some other way of doing it. But there are some sort of rarer situations when it is possible. So something like, for example, they track elephant numbers in reserves in Africa, for example. So here is an example from a national park in Kenya, where they're able to track the number of elephants, because elephants are big. It's not like there's 3 billion of them. There's in this park, there's like 760, right? So it's a number that you can deal with. And because they're big, you can fly around and spot them. And also they have individual, you know, certain features of their tusk shape or ear shapes and things like that, where you can actually identify individual elephants. So you can go out and actually keep a track of these exact numbers on these things, or very near exact numbers. But in other cases, when it's not possible to do that, the more typical situation is you need some method of being able to do a survey that you can then count in a quantitative way how many individuals live in a certain area, and then try and extrapolate that to your population level. So two typical ways of doing this, depending upon the type of habitat and organism you're dealing with. One of them might be looking at using transects. So this is often used on coral reef studies, for example. So a transect is you just put a line down randomly placed across your population. And then in this example, somebody is swimming along that line. And depending upon how you set up your survey, you know, this person might be scoring the number of individuals of different species that, you know, perhaps the line intersects. Or, you know, you might do it so, you know, anything within a 1 meter path, for example, of that line. So you'd measure how long that line is. You would score the number of species and individuals. Then you would do a bunch of replicates of randomly placed lines, you know, maybe 10 times or 100 times or something, and then extrapolate to the size of the coral reef as a whole, okay, to get your population number. Another way of doing this is using quadrats. This is something that you can do, you know, in vegetated patches. It's something that people often use on rocky shores and things like that. Where you just randomly place an area like a 1/4 of a meter squared or whatever it is. You count everything in there. You do that, you know, a whole bunch of times, making sure that you place stuff randomly so it's non-biased. Get the density per area and then extrapolate to your population as a whole. Okay, so that's one way that you might be able to track individual numbers in your population over time. Now, another way of doing this, and this is often used in fish studies, is to use mark recapture methods. Okay, so in this example, there's some bug here that people are trying to figure out how many live within a certain population. And what you can go out is go out to the habitat and randomly sample a number of individuals. Say you capture, what have they got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, but you probably want more than that. But you would somehow mark those individuals so that if you capture them in the future, you can recognize and score that individual. So when you're doing fish studies, you know, they put little tags in fish, let them go in the ocean. So if a survey catches it again, or if an angler catches it, they can, you know, read off a ID number and report it, and you get information on that individual. So in this study, what we really want to know is N, capital N, which is the number of individuals. Deer pics, I pull them off my dog occasionally. Yes, they're very common on my dog this time of year. So what we want to know is N, how many individuals are in the population. That's what we don't know. But if we go out and take a sample and we capture small n1 individuals, we know we captured 5 individuals, right? And we've marked them. And now we let them go back into the population. And our assumption is that they're going to sort of mix around in that population at random. And then later, you might go back and take another sample, like capture another number of individuals from that population. So here you've gone back and you happen to capture N2 individuals from the population, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again. And if you're lucky, you'll find that some of them have got that mark that you placed on it from your first sample. So here, what you've done is you've marked this proportion of the population. We don't know N, but we know that we've marked N1 individuals. Okay, so that's the proportion of individuals in the population marked. Then we've recaptured a certain amount, and we know what proportion of them are now marked in the population. We can see M number have got a mark, and we know that we captured N2 individuals. And so our assumption is that this ratio is the same as that ratio. And we want to know N, the number of individuals in the population. So you can rearrange this equation like this. So what we want to know is n, and it's going to be the n1 times the n2 divided by m. Okay, that can give us an estimate of the number of individuals in the population. But we have some key assumptions within this. We're assuming that these are randomly mixing within the population. We're making other assumptions, such as when you put a mark on something, it doesn't make them more likely to die, and that there is no death between this time and that time, etc. So there are some basic assumptions that we're making. These mark recapture models get fancier and fancier that can take all these types of things into account. But at the most basic level, this is essentially what they're trying to do. Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about population growth rates and how they change over time. So when we refer to population growth, we're just our aim is to describe the change in population numbers over time. And it's worth bearing in mind at this point that this can take a number of factors into account. So if you're studying the demography of population, that's the study of the population dynamics based upon factors such as not just birth rates and death rates and immigration and emigration, factors we've talked about, but also things like age composition, age at maturity, number of offspring, etc. And this is important if you can imagine that you know, you're some species that doesn't become sexually mature until you're 2, and there's 1,000 individuals in the population, but 950 of them are age 1, so they're not sexually mature. That's going to affect how quickly your population can grow, because you know, they're not mature yet. So that's what demography does. It's a sort of more it takes more factors into account, and it takes the population structure into account. So I mentioned that there are certain key aspects that are driving changes in population numbers over time, and we can express this in a mathematical sense. So when we look at population growth, so population numbers change over time based on birth rates, so births and deaths, immigration and emigration. Those are the key factors that are driving population numbers. So you can express this numerically. If we want to know the population number n at some time t, that is going to be equal to a previous time, so at time 0, number of individuals in the population at time 0, plus the number of births that have occurred, minus the deaths that have occurred, plus the number of immigrants that have come into the population, and minus the number of immigrants that have gone out of the population. So we can add all of those together to find out what our new population at one time step forward will be. And when people study populations, in many instances, they make the assumption that they're studying a closed system. What does that mean? It means that they're kind of assuming that immigration and emigration are, you can ignore those factors, and that if they are going on, they're essentially balancing one another out on average. Okay, and so it focuses in on these births and the deaths that occur within the population. Now, the number of births and deaths can also be expressed in terms of birth rates. So this big B is occurring to the number of births that occur, you know, in over the course of 1 year, for example. That is equal to small b, which is the birth rate, number of births per individual, multiplied by the number of individuals in the population. Okay. So if you've got 100 individuals and the average birth rate is 1 birth per individual, then big B after 1 year is going to be 100, because everybody's had 1 baby. Okay, Similarly, you can calculate the number of deaths with respect to the death rate, number of deaths per individual, multiplied by the number of individuals, okay? So this is the total number of births and the total number of deaths. These small b's and small d's refer to the rate of births and the rate of deaths. So our next step in this is that this delta n refers to the change in number of individuals in the population. And the change that has occurred is number of births minus number of deaths, which, as we've just shown here, is birth rate times the number of individuals minus death rate times the number of individuals, okay? So these things are all equivalent. The change in the population size is number of births minus number of deaths, which equals birth rate times number of individuals minus death rate times number of individuals. Now, mathematically, you can put these together. It's B minus D times N, okay, in this. And these, in population models, is typically referred to as R, okay? So R is the per capita growth rate of the population that takes into account the birth rates and the death rates and is combining it into a single number, basically. So when R is greater than 0, the population is going up, because you've got the change in population number will be something positive times n. And when R is less than 0, the population number is going down. Okay, so this factor R is controlling population changes in population, positive or negative. Now, just as an aside on this, you probably follow in the news. You see this R number of COVID a metric that is tracked to look at changes. This isn't that R number is not directly equivalent to this number, just in case you're interested, okay? But it's a similar concept. Yeah, dog is good. She's treated. So it's a similar concept. The difference with the COVID R number is that it's actually a 1 means the population is stable. Anything above 1 is equivalent to this. Population is going up. Everything below 1 for the COVID R value means population is going down. So it's a similar concept, but it's not directly equivalent to this R value that we're talking about here, okay? Just in case you were going to get those confused. Okay, let's explore this concept of exponential growth that I'm sure you've heard about. Now, if births are greater than deaths in the population, that R value in the population model will be positive. And this can lead to exponential growth, okay? And what that means is the rate at which numbers in the population are increasing over time gets faster and faster and faster. The slope of this, it starts off slow and then it gets quick. And the reason for that is that when you have a new offspring, and then that one is going to start having offspring as well. And the offspring with that will start having offspring. So it's getting quicker and quicker and quicker. A bit like your compound interest if you have, saving in the bank or something like that. So left unchecked, the population would soon swamp the earth, basically. It would just, it would take off so quickly and keep on going and keep on getting quicker that, this is an impossible rate to sustain. Exponential growth adds a multiple number of population size. Yeah, okay. J-shaped curve. So, just trying to get my screen organized here. An example of when this can occur in nature occurs when you get an invasive species. I know you've done essays on an invasive species as part of your lab work. And so there you get a new species that arrives in a habitat where it's an excellent competitor and is able to take over. And at that stage, when a invasive species first arrives, it can experience this exponential growth. Okay, something like the zebra mussel that arrived from Europe in ballast water of ships in, not sure, quite a while ago, but I can't remember the exact date. Maybe one of you did your essay on that. I'm trying to, I can't move my screens around while I've got my laser pointer on, and in fact, there it goes. So it's just turned off now. There, okay. So now I can see my notes. So you get that very rapid expansion when something arrives into a new habitat that has got an open niche for it to occupy. So why don't populations expand forever? Why don't, you know, things completely take over the Earth so that we can't move? And the reason is you have something that's called a density dependent factor that limits the per capita growth rate, the number of babies that you have per year, for example. And this changes according to the density of the population. That's why it's a density dependent factor, okay? So for example, certain key resources become limiting. If you're expanding a number, you need more food, more shelter, etc. And those are going to become limiting because everybody's eating them. Predators may be attracted. If you're a prey organism, predators may be attracted to where you get these really high numbers, and so your predation numbers, your death rate essentially might start going up because more predators are eating you. Or pathogens might, diseases might cause death because pathogens can spread much more easily when you have a very dense population, and perhaps if limiting resources are putting you in a worse body condition, then you're more vulnerable to diseases anyway. So all of these factors are coming into play. And what that means is, instead of expanding an exponential rate forever, population growth rate starts, the brakes start to come on, okay? Because the rate at which you can reproduce starts declining, and your death rate might start increasing, okay? Until you approach a theoretical carrying capacity, K, for the habitat that you live in. So this is the number that the habitat can sustain. You know, I grow this much food in this area, and this organism needs this, you know, X amount of food to live. There's only that amount of resources available. There's only that much space available ultimately, right? So we've talked about R, which is the population growth rate, and K, which is the carrying capacity of the habitat, the maximum number it can sustain. And these get combined into what's called this logistic growth model, okay, that can be used for modeling population changes over time. So when you had exponential growth, all you had was R times N, carries on increasing forever. This logistic growth model has an extra component that essentially, in a mathematical sense, puts the brakes on and brings you ultimately to this theoretical K value, right, in a stable system. So let's think what this is. Here you have R times N increasing. This modifier is basically a K value, the carrying capacity. And so you have K minus N divided by K. So when N is less than K, growth is positive here, okay? It's a ratio. And so growth is occurring. When N equals K, you have K minus N is going to be 0 divided by K, which is going to be 0. So the population growth rate is going to be 0. It's not changing over time, okay? And then when N is greater than K, like say the population had overshot the carrying capacity, now this is going to become a negative value, and you're going to have negative growth. So what would happen is you go up like this, and then you would come down and basically come down to meet K again, okay? So this is the logistic growth model. It's got a growth component and your brakes, basically, bringing in the carrying capacity of the habitat. So let's just look at effect and what effects these different parameters within the model have. So here what I've done is I've plotted what happens if you have a logistic growth model when you have a K of 1,000. So your population your habitat can sustain 1,000 individuals. And I've kept that the same, but I've modified R. So here you've got an R of 0.3, a faster growth rate in the population, and here you've got an R of 0.2. So what happens is they come up to the same carrying capacity because K is the same, but this one does it quicker because it has a faster population growth rate, okay? Alternatively, you might keep, so here what I've done is fixed R at 0.2 and 0.2 in both situations, but I've modified K. So this habitat, the brown one, can only sustain 500 individuals. This one can sustain 1,000 individuals. So they initially start at the same rate, population growth rate, but this one, the break comes on sooner and it stabilizes at 500, and this one keeps going and it stabilizes at 1,000. So these values within the model, R and K, are modifying the shape of this curve, okay? So what we've just talked about there is the concept of density dependent factors, right? I was saying that the density of the population is changing how your population growth rate is occurring and your population numbers, okay? It's density dependent. You also have this concept of density independent. This is something, so some factor other than the density of your population is changing numbers. And this can include things like, you know, extreme weather events, like if you have a really harsh winter and some animals die because they can't live in that really cold condition. Or you get a hurricane that comes in and wipes things out, for example. So here's an example with eastern bluebirds in Ohio from a long-term population monitoring study done from, you know, the 1960s through to 2000. And this is the number of individuals in the population in different years. And what it shows here is that when you got to this year here in the 1970s, where there was a really extreme winter, I think 76 was a really extreme winter, there was a bunch of birds that died, basically. They couldn't take it. So numbers went way down. And then you go through this population growth factor, okay? Because now you've released, so here you've got a density independent factor that's changing numbers. Now your growth rate in the population has gone up because you've modified your density dependent factor. There's less individuals. They grow and they'll come back up towards this level, okay? So density dependent factors and density independent factors. Okay, let's consider this aspect of life histories that affects how populations grow over time. And we've talked about life histories a little bit previously in other lectures. But the life history of an organism, it varies in a way. So what it's saying is that organisms vary in the way that they allocate resources, energy, etc., during their lifetime. And some of the key ways in which this can occur is the size at birth, for example. You know, we as humans have quite a few large offspring by comparison to, you know, something like, I don't know, a fish that might be the same size as a human but produces millions of teeny eggs, for example. Difference in the way that you're allocating resources. The growth rate, the rate of how fast one organism or one individual grows with respect to another. Age and size that you become mature. So, you know, humans can't have babies until, you know, they're in their teens or something, whereas, you know, a squirrel can have a baby whenever, I guess, in the first year or two of life, okay? The number, size, and sex ratio of the offspring. So as I mentioned before, the size and age and size specific reproductive investments, age and size specific mortality schedule, so how long we live for basically, and our length of life. So in an example here, I've just sort of shown two organisms, two plants with really extreme differences in growth rates. A sequoia tree that live along the coast of California that can live, I mean, these things can live for more than 3,000 years. I mean, it's incredible, and weigh 4 million pounds. Whereas you can go to an annual species that you know, put in the plant in the summer or something, such as this petunia, which is, you know, a small thing that weighs maybe half a pound or something, and will just live for a single year. Huge difference in the life history of how these two types of plants conduct their life, basically. And this comes back down to this concept of trade-offs that we've talked about in two previous different lectures. Okay, and it prevails throughout, basically. There are trade-offs involved in how you allocate your resources during your lifetime. So what does it say here? Life history involves trade-offs, balance. There's a balance of where limited resources should be allocated to optimize fitness. So for example, in this trade-off I'm showing here, you might allocate energy towards growth, or things like muscles and bones and getting bigger. And that might benefit you in the long term because you might be better at escaping from predators or competing for mates and things like that. Or if there's a, you know, I only have so much energy to allocate, instead, maybe I could invest that in reproduction and produce eggs and produce, you know, offspring to the next generation. But I have a choice, so to speak, or there's a trade-off for where I can do that. If I do more here, it's going to take away from my growth, and vice versa. Okay. And this can influence life histories in different ways. So, for example, you can have species that reproduce in a so-called semelparous way versus an iteroparous way. Semelparous means that basically, when it comes to reproductive time, you put everything in there, everything goes in reproduction, and then essentially you die because you've invested so much of your energy in that reproductive output. An example of that are salmon species. Sockeye salmon that live on the west coast, they live for 3 to 5 years, and they go out, they're born in rivers, they go out to the Pacific Ocean and feed, come back a few years later, and then everything goes into reproduction in that river, and they don't go back out to ocean again. Okay. Whereas versus something like this, the striped bass that if it's not caught by an angler might live up to about 30 years, and they become sexually mature at ages 2 to 8, depending upon partly whether they're male or female. But they can reproduce over that time multiple times, like every year, for example, once they've reached sexual maturity. So reproductive effort is spread throughout their lifetime, and instead of blowing it all on the first time they can reproduce, they still allocate energy towards growth and then other survival necessities. Seasonally, striped bass season recently started in Long Island Sound. It's common courtesy to throw back really large females because it is common courtesy. It's also the law in most instances. I think they have, you're only allowed one, and I think there's a slot limit for them. But yes, there are management sort of processes that help reinforce that concept, basically. So these differences in the way that animals or organisms conduct their lives can lead to different types of so-called survivorship curves. And a sort of nice way of categorizing these is thinking of them in terms of what's referred to as type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship curves. Okay, so here in this plot, we've got age of the individual, so how old they live up till their maximum lifespan. And this on a log scale is the number of survivors. You know, if you start off with 1,000 in population when they're born, what it looks like over time. So in a type 1 survivorship, you get a really high survival throughout most of your life until you get really, you know, old and decrepit, basically, and then everybody starts dying. Okay. So you know, something like humans, for example, would be an example of this. You know, it's not like we have 1,000 babies and at the age 1 there's only, you know, 3 of them left or something. Most babies survive, and most individuals, not everybody obviously, a high proportion of individuals survive until later in life, until we, you know, reach the end of our maximum lifespan. Whereas other types of organisms, you know, you get a really high mortality rate right at the beginning, and just high mortality rates throughout your life, and so you've got this completely different shaped curve. And then the type 2 is basically something in between, basically. So type 3, most individuals die young. Type 2, individuals face a constant risk of mortality at all ages. So some examples of these. So, you know, many mammals will have this, humans included, something along these lines. Weeds and things would be a typical example of a type 3. The example I've given in the book is the shore barnacle. When they first arrive as tiny little spat that land on rocks, the vast majority of them, they don't make it, basically. They're eaten by crabs and things like that. So they have really high mortality when they're young. And then something like, you know, many birds have something that's in between there, basically. So the life history patterns that we've been talking about, are sea turtles considered? Well, you see, sea turtles are an interesting example, right? Because type 1 are often long-lived organisms, okay? And a sea turtle is, many of them, I mean, they can live for over 100 years, like really, really long-lived. But one thing I didn't mention in here is that these are nice ways of categorizing these things. But as you'll become familiar in ecology and nature in general, there are many instances where things buck the trend. And the sea turtle is an interesting example of that, because they're really long-lived, but they have a sort of, they produce a lot of eggs because they go through these massive migrations and only reproduce every 2 or 3 years. And those eggs have a really low survival. So what they do is they have something where it goes down like this, and then those that get to a certain age will survive for, you know, a long, long time, and then go down like that. So, you know, not everybody fits nicely into these nice little neat boxes. Okay, so let's talk about some more about life history patterns. Okay. They can vary among individuals, populations, and species due to a combination of genetic factors, something that's inherent in your DNA, and these environmental factors, things that you have no control of, such as, you know, climate, for example. Okay. So genetic factors, genes controlling life history traits, evolve in response to selective pressures. I'll show you an example of that in a second. Whereas with environmental factors, changing environmental conditions affect the organism's ability to invest in growth and reproduction, etc. So you get annual variation in food resources, for example, that might affect your life history patterns. This is a great example of genetic control of life history patterns. In Trinidad, in the Caribbean, you get rivers that have these little guppies that live in them, and they've been very intensely studied since about the 1960s, particularly by people at Irvine University in California. And what they've found is that in the lower parts of the rivers, you get guppies, but you also get a whole bunch of other species that predate these guppies, large fish that eat them. And they have a high mortality rate because of that. Whereas in upstream areas that are separated by these waterfalls, you don't get these large predatory fishes, although you do get guppies. And so they're not subject to that high predation pressure. And what they found was that the upstream guppies have high survival, And they also have different life history tactics where they put more energy into growth. They have longer life expectancy. They mature later. They reproduce less frequency, and they have less offspring per brood. Whereas the opposite occurs in all these high predation areas down here. And so one of the questions might be, you see this in nature, well, is that an environmental effect or is that a genetic effect? So what they did was they then brought some of these back to the lab and bred them through multiple generations. And you still get these same traits under constant laboratory conditions. It's independent of the environment they're in. And they've done other experiments where they take fish from one area, put them in another area, etc., leave them for a while, and then find actually genetic changes in those fish occur over time. So a whole bunch of experiments have demonstrated this is genetic.
So that's epigenetics, right? When the selection pressure is changing their genetics?
No, and epigenetics, so this is a genetic factor because it's selection, it's genetic selection of gene frequencies, allele frequencies. So it's actually a genetic thing. The epigenetics refers to, you might have the same genes and the same alleles, but the way that they operate is modified epigenetically by modifiers that are modified by the environment. So epigenetics is a sort of way that the environment is modifying the genetic effect. But this is actually a change in allele frequency. So it is evolution of genetic traits that occurs within this, this bit, okay? So an example of an environmental effect is shown from this study in snow geese, a long-term population study. So the population size increased over a 14-year period. So here you can see over this 14-year period, the estimated population size times 1,000 of number of geese in the population went up. So it was going up at that point in time. However, if you looked at what was happening in terms of the clutch size, so the number of eggs per nest, it was going down at the same time. So although there were more of these things, the number of eggs they produce every time they nested went down, okay? And other things were occurring as well. So the weight of each chick that was born also decreased over time. And also the survival of those chicks decreased over time, okay? And this makes, you know, some kind of intuitive sense in that you might be getting a higher number of individuals, so you've got more density, so perhaps there's now more competition for food amongst them, you've got less food to go and feed on, so you can produce less eggs, etc. Okay, they have these knock-on effects due to some density-dependent factor. You can speculate was driving this. And this all relates back to that concept of the logistic growth model that we were talking about, right? We talked about how when you have these density-dependent factors, you have competition, etc., that's coming into play. And in the model, it was being modified by this K minus N factor, right? So this is how this is coming in. So you've got the population number going up, increase in N there, okay? It's modifying that value, okay, and reducing your overall population growth rate. They're feeding into this in terms of the mathematical concept of how we're modeling it, okay? Now, life history traits also change in humans. A large component driven by environmental influences, and our life history has changed dramatically over time. And this can be shown just in this figure here, from going back to the 1840s through to, well, where are we? So this goes through to about 2000. And this is showing the life expectancy, how long the average person lives in different countries. And you can pick a country, so, you know, New Zealand, over time, it's increased over time. And this is because, you know, the way that we live has improved dramatically over time. In terms of medicines, we have vaccines now, right? And food supply and water supply and sewage. Before we had good sewage supplies, people would be dying left, right, and center from diseases caught from sewage, etc. So these are environmental influences that have generally increased human life expectancy over time. Why non-Maori? I don't know the study specifically. I'm guessing that non-Maoris, their life expectancy is different. And so they've removed that factor. I'm guessing, you know, I'm sure they looked at the Maoris as well, but I'm guessing that's why. Okay. And there's other traits that have changed as well. Okay. This is not the same graph that you have in the version I gave out to you. I gave a more recent version that I got here from Wikipedia. But this is showing that basically life expectancy changes is different between different countries, okay, due to basically environmental influences of how well we have, you know, systems that help sustain us alive. In somewhere that, you know, might have poor healthcare and things like that, then life expectancy is generally lower than really advanced countries, okay, where they have great health, they have great, you know, everything, I guess. It varies over time. So actually a huge difference between, you know, the 50s through to, you know, I guess if you're a Monaco woman, okay, you can live till, on average, a very long time. There is also a difference in this male-female survival. So this green line here would show if you're a male, your life expectancy was the same as a female, which is on this axis. And in pretty much all instances, the females have a greater life expectancy. It's thought that that's a combination of genetic and behavioral aspects. There are some genetic aspects in terms of, for example, the way our sex hormones interact with our immune system that are thought to make it favorable basically to be female. And we see that with COVID survival, right? Women generally have a higher survival. But there are also behaviors of men that basically, you know, we do more dumb stuff, I guess. Smoke more, drink more alcohol, drive faster, stuff like that. That mean that, you know, we pay for it. This can also be reflected in terms of our the number of offspring that humans have, okay? So here, this is a measure of countries' development index. So richer countries basically have a higher development index. They can invest more in healthcare and things like that. And the number of children per woman goes down on average with the country's development index. And you can also see this over time, that each line represents a country as they've improved in development index over time. In a very undeveloped country, you might have a really high mortality rate of your young, and so therefore there's an incentive to have more offspring. Okay, someone's got their microphone on, so you just need to silence that, please, whoever that may be.
I tried recording on my laptop. It's all black.
Although it might be more interesting, I'm not sure, but. Anyway, and actually there are some studies to show that there's been a slight uptick at this really high developed rate here, development index, that has been associated with increases in like gender equality and things like that. But generally a decrease in the birth rate with index. So I'm going to do one more. I click a question before I move on here. Just to remind us about this logistic growth model, which is an important concept before we talk about the last aspect, okay? So the question here, and I'll open it up, is, so recall the logistic growth model where we had the birth rate times the number of individuals in the population, multiplied by carrying capacity of the population minus n divided by k again. And which do you think applies in these instances? And I've given two types of organisms. One of them is an anchovy, which is a small, short-lived organism, fish, extremely numerous and the basis of the food chain in many areas. So these are eaten by lots of other things. And then I've given an example of a blue whale, something that can live for decades. The question is, which do you think of these applies in the logistic growth model? So R is the reproductive rate of the population, and K is the carrying capacity. So do you think anchovies have a high R and a low K? Blue whales have a low R and a high K, etc. Which of these do you think makes sense? Okay, for this. K is the carrying capacity, okay? So if I live in a habitat and the maximum it can sustain is 1,000 individuals, 1,000 would be, you know, K would be 1,000. That's my buffer of what the habitat can contain. R is the rate at which the population can increase, okay? If it's like, if there were no brakes on, a bigger R means that you can increase in number more quickly. K is the carrying capacity, the maximum number that the habitat can sustain, okay? So if your habitat can only hold 1,000 elephants, K equals 1,000. Okay, got 171 so far, 172. I'll give you 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, half, and 0. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what do we think we have here? Okay, what are people saying? Okay, 91. Okay, so this is the one that makes the most sense, okay? So anchovies are a small species that occur in like huge schools and things like that, and they're not very long-lived. They have the capacity to increase in number very, very quickly, okay? If K is carrying capacity, then how is K on a blue whale low? So do you think there's more, in answer to that question, so how many anchovies do you think there are in the ocean compared to how many blue whales? Okay, so K is a maximum number it can sustain. So you're going to have a high number. These occur in like massive schools, some of these anchovy schools. So they can increase in number quickly, and you can have lots and lots and lots of them. Blue whales, they only have a small number of offspring, I don't know, 1 or 2 or something at a time, and not every year. And so R is going to be low. You can't suddenly go from 100 whales to 5,000 whales in a year, okay? But you could do with these things. And blue whales are huge and eat an enormous amount of food, so the habitat can sustain less of them. There's probably several billion or trillion, I don't know, anchovies in the world. There's definitely nothing like that. There's tens of thousands or something of blue whales. Okay, so the answer, what was it, is D. There you go. Okay, so just bearing in mind that sort of general concept of what R and K are doing. Okay, no, those K should be high, so I'm confused. The K should be high. Blue whales, K, the number of individuals the population can sustain is low compared to an anchovy. Okay. So this comes to this concept of a general categorization. Remember, like I said, categorizations in ecology are generally general, and there are often violators of these categories. This is a general categorization that you hear frequently about an R and a K strategist. Okay, so an R strategist is something that is able to quickly occupy a vacant niche or habitat that becomes available. They can move into that space and they can increase the numbers quickly. Okay, their lifestyle is governed by this quick reproductive rate that they have. Okay, so they can tolerate unpredictable conditions by using a wide variety of resources. Okay, so these are some general features about these R strategists. Typically reproduce once, so similarity is what it's referred to as. But greater allocation, so they allocate a lot of energy towards reproduction, which means they have a lower survival, but they can increase their population numbers very quickly. Short lifespan, density independent mortality. So because you've got a short lifespan, and they're not investing a lot in their in themselves, they're investing it in the reproductive output. They can't deal with this environmental variation so well. Typical type 3 survivorship, etc. An example of these are things like weeds and flies, and I suppose rabbits. I mean, more these two here, I think. Okay, poor competitors possibly that can increase numbers very quickly. Whereas a K strategist is something that's a good competitor that can gradually outcompete all of these R strategists. Okay, so when you have an area of habitat that becomes available, it's often first occupied by these R strategists. You know, weeds and things will move into a clearing, and then over time, a K strategist will take over. A good competitor, something like a tree that grows and invests in not all of its energy just in reproductive output, but in growth and survival of itself, and gradually it grow, shade everywhere out, and outcompete those other organisms. Okay, so they thrive in predictable environments. They have a slower population growth rates, but longer lifespans. Okay, so this is a general categorization. It's been criticized because there are many examples that don't fit nice and neatly into this box, that sea turtle example that we talked about earlier on. So it's better to think of this really as a sort of a continuum rather than just two extremes. Okay, that's a more appropriate way of thinking about this. Okay. Okay, lastly, I just want to talk about how this concept of population biology is really important. It's key, in fact, for conservation and management of species. In terms of resource managers, so when you're harvesting something like a fish population, for example, managers are often, you know, they don't want their species that they're harvesting to go extinct, but they also want to make as much money as possible out of them, or harvest them as high as possible sustainably. And this is where this concept of maximum sustainable yield comes in. And so the idea here is that the maximum sustainable yield is the harvesting or the mortality rate that you impose on that population that reduces the population to where the population growth rate is fastest. Okay, so if you imagine this logistical growth model here, so over time and the population size, this is how it might increase up to its carrying capacity. Now, if you're harvesting the population, you're driving it back down this curve. Okay, you're driving the numbers down, but the reproductive rate of that population is going to increase because you've got less density dependent feedback in it now. And the idea is this is where that curve is steepest. Okay, so you've got the fastest population growth rate occurring. The idea is to sort of harvest them down to this point where they're renewing themselves as quickly as possible, and sort of you're scooping off all the benefits that are coming from that maximum renewal. This is often easier done than said, and people overshoot this because population numbers are doing other things. They're changing due to density independent factors over time, and also it's really difficult to know where you are on this curve. Okay, it's not like the African Kenyan reserve situation where you can go out and count every individual. You might only have a rough idea of where you are on this curve. But the concept of maximum sustainable yield is what this is based around. Often managers these days will try and aim for something more around here now because it's a more conservative approach. Also, the type of life histories that these animals have affects the way in which you can sustainably exploit them, okay? So things that are very, very long-lived and have slow reproductive rates, you have to have a much more conservative harvesting strategy from them. So, you know, in the bad old days when we used to go out and harvest blue whales, for example, their numbers, I mean, they almost went extinct. That's because they take a very, very long time to become mature, and then they only reproduce at a very slow rate, you know, 1 or 2 individuals per however often it is, year or 2 or something. So as you drive these numbers down, it takes them a very long time to replenish what you've taken away, versus if you're harvesting those anchovies, for example, it's a short-lived species and they have a much higher population growth rate. So the way in which you can exploit these is different in a sustainable manner. The final concept with this population biology and how it affects conservation management is this, I want to go back to this meta-population idea that we talked about, where you might have different parts of habitat where an organism can live, and there's some connectivity between them because perhaps some migrate from A to B, or you know, seeds get blown from A to B, etc. But not all of these populations might be sort of considered the same worth in terms of their conservation aspect, because some populations might act as what's referred to as a source, and some might be act as what's called a sink. So what does that mean? Let's start with the sink population concept. This is a type of population that may frequently receive immigrants arriving to it by some manner, active or passive dispersal, but it rarely gives individuals back to other areas. Perhaps if you think of that ocean concept where eggs are drifting in the currents, if you're the very downstream part of the population in a chain of islands, anything that you spawn now is going to be lost and downstream and is never going to come back to the upstream islands. So you're a sink, whereas something that's way upstream might be a source for all these other downstream populations. And this is important if some of these sinks go extinct. It's not necessarily such a big deal because they can be repopulated later by these source populations. But if you eliminate these source populations, well, that's going to impact everybody now because nobody is repopulating this, okay? I've just put in here this last idea about the spot fin butterfly fish. This is a butterfly fish that occurs in the summer up along the coast here. They occur from Brazil through to Massachusetts, but they're really a sort of more warm water tropical species. And we get small ones that arrive in the currents from the eggs and larvae in the spring, and they grow and they survive. But around these waters, these things don't migrate. And what happens is we're a sink population for these. All these little baby ones that we see here, when it comes to winter, they're goners basically. They die. We're a sink population. All those areas that are down in warmer areas, they're the source population. Okay? Water individuals flow out of the source population, not back to the source. Correct, yes. So the source is not getting a return, basically. Okay, and I put in the general summary slide. It's 1:30, we're a lecture behind, no big deal, don't worry about it. We get to where we get to, and you won't get examined on beyond where we get to, okay? What we still have achieved. So you have your achieve assignments, right? I meant to say that at the beginning. Tomorrow is your last achieve assignments, and I put it on the title of the achieve, like this is your last achieve assignment. So you won't have any next year, okay? Next week is what I'm saying, or next year. What's PM? Don't get a chance to do. Sorry, I'm just reading the rest of your thing. We still have Achieve assignments due at 11:59 p.m. since we didn't get a chance to do today's lecture. Yeah, just do the Achieve. Okay, it's fine. Okay. Great. I'll hang on for a couple of minutes. I'll turn off the recording if anyone wants to ask questions. Otherwise, regular office hours at 2 o'clock in half an hour. Okay, via Blackboard link that I've given you for a Zoom link. Okay. Thanks very much, guys.